Greetings History 141 students. John Fia here, Megan behind the camera as usual. Today we want to talk about the second part of the Jacksonian lecture. We've been playing around here with the lectures a little bit. Remember, a couple weeks ago we did a virtual office hours and I did a lecture on the rise of democracy. Then recently this week we went back and looked at the way in which democracy then plays itself out in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the so-called age of Jackson, the so-called age of democracy. We started off by talking about the one-party political system, how by this point the Federalists are off the scene. Most of the politicians running for president, say in 1824, are Jeffersonian Republicans, or they're often referred to as National Republicans. We talked about the election of 1824 and the so-called corrupt bargain. Again, 1824 is important because this is the first year in American politics that they count the popular vote. And Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote. He doesn't have enough electoral votes to get elected president, so the race has to be thrown into the House of Representatives. But clearly the people have spoken, and they want Jackson. Of course, though, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay worked this deal together. Clay throws his votes behind John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams becomes the President of the United States. Jackson sees this as a great scandal. The people have spoken and their voice is not heard. He's quickly going to be involved in organizing the Democratic Party. That is, yes, the Democratic Party that we have today. That Democratic Party is going to appeal to the commoners. It's going to appeal to farmers on the frontier, to the urban workers, the immigrants in the cities, and so forth. And in 1828, Jackson is going to ride as the candidate of the Democratic Party, is going to defeat John Quincy Adams and become president. We define the Jackson presidency in terms of this tension that exists between liberty and power. Right? Jackson wants to do the will of the people. He believes he has a mandate from the people to lead according to their will. Thus, he wants to provide liberty and freedom. Let the people's voice be heard. But for his political opponents, they're very, very concerned about the so-called tyranny of the people, the tyranny of the 51%, the tyranny of the majority. And sometimes when Jackson is following the will of the people, he looks to be exercising, again, going back to that Whig political thought that we talked about at the time of the Revolution, he begins exercising power. So again, think about the Jackson presidency in terms of this tension between liberty and power. Then what we did was we gave 3 examples of how that tension between liberty and power plays itself out. First was the Nullification Crisis, in which Jackson says the will of the people cannot be held captive by the will of one state, namely South Carolina. And this is why he refuses to embrace South Carolina's call for nullification. Go back and look at your notes, your textbook, to get the context for that. The second issue, the Indian removal of 1830, which Jackson sees as a very democratic act. He wants to remove the Indians, send them to Oklahoma, or what was then known as Indian country, because he wants to follow the will of the people who elected him, namely all of those white settlers who don't like the Indians around. So in the name of democracy, which again, democracy being a very white male idea in the 1830s, nevertheless, it is still democracy. Jackson says, let's get the Indians out of there, and he removes them. And I talked about his sort of paternalism in all of this, right? I'm helping the Indians. I'm keeping them safe. I'm protecting them against these white settlers who may hurt them or kill them, all in the process of removing them, while he's removing them from their native lands, their ancestral lands, the Creeks, the Cherokees, and so forth. And then you have the famous Trail of Tears. Now, again, liberty and power, think about this, right? To the white Democratic voters who voted Jackson into office, this looks like a great move of liberty. He's giving them their freedom. They don't want the Indians there, and they have the freedom to do that. They can now move into Indian land and pursue their dreams. They can pursue the American dream. They can own land. They can, live freely without the threat of Indian attacks. And Jackson wants to support that. Of course, for those who defend the Indians and the Indians themselves, Jackson looks like a tyrant. Power, right? And then the third example was the National Bank. in which Jackson destroys the national bank, basically does not renew it after its 20-year term is up in 1836, and breaks it up and puts all the money into the various pet banks, the state banks. This, again, for those who are his economic opponents, looks like tyranny. The National Bank is doing well. It's stabilizing the economy. It's giving loans to build bridges and roads and infrastructure. Jackson's going to undermine all of that development by closing the National Bank. But for Jackson, he wants economic decisions to be made by the people at the local level. So let's divvy up all the money and put them in the state banks. Liberty versus power. And then we finally see then the rise of the oppositional party, the Whigs, who are then going to come up and basically oppose the Democratic Party and the Jackson Party. And we'll talk a little bit more about them as we move on in the semester. So again, some complicated stuff there about Jackson, but again, see that tension. Try to understand that the entire Jacksonian period through this tension between liberty and power. See you next time.